What's up, Nestor, is the Russian dude. This year, the Russian government had removed everything connected to YouTube from the national domain name register. And on the surface, this looks like one more dramatic step towards a completely isolated Russian internet. But when you look beneath the announcement, the story becomes almost the opposite, because this is not really a demonstration of unlimited state power. It is the evidence that Roskomnadzor, Russia's media and communications watchdog, pretty much the ones who block everything and everyone, it is pretty much struggling to devote enough technology, computing capacity and human expertise to pressure Telegram, while also maintaining a nationwide campaign against YouTube, WhatsApp, VPN services, independent media, and every other platform the authorities would prefer Russians to never see and never use. The most important part of today's story is therefore not that YouTube disappears from a Russian DNS register, because a DNS level restriction is one of the simplest and most easily bypassed tools available, but that the government had to reach for this blunt instrument at the exact moment when filtering Telegram traffic was demanding deep packet inspection, or DPI, increasingly sophisticated AI models, and enormous amounts of real-time analysis across a country of roughly 140 million people. Which means that the authorities may have the political desire to pressure everything, yet they still have to choose where to spend their limited technical resources. And when they concentrate on one major target, weaknesses, as you would imagine, begin appearing somewhere else. So today, we need to talk about why the image of an all-powerful government is often more important than its actual capabilities, how Roskomnadzor's technical systems work, why the difference between a political order and a technical enforcement changes everything, and why 13, well almost 14 to be honest, years after the Russian authorities began their major battle against the open internet in the fall of 2012, Russians are still watching YouTube, reading Meduza, Mediazona and BBC News Russian, calling relatives through WhatsApp, exchanging messages on Telegram, and finding new routes almost daily around every single digital wall that was presented as completely inevitable. Here is the most surprising part of today's video, so let's get straight into it. The greatest advantage of a powerful government is not always the amount of money, technology or personnel it actually possesses, because sometimes the greatest advantage is simply convincing the public that those resources are unlimited. And once people believe that the resistance cannot possibly even change the outcome, the state no longer just needs to even spend as much or anything on enforcing its will, since fear, resignation and the expectation of defeat begin doing part of the government's work for it. This is why the idea of a government omnipotence and omnipresence can become such a limiting belief, because when citizens assume that every platform will inevitably be blocked, every independent voice will eventually disappear and every workaround will sooner or later stop working, so it's no surprise that it's no wonder that many people just decide not to even invest time, money or energy into building alternatives. Creators abandon YouTube channels before the platform is actually inaccessible. Media organizations search for replacement technologies before their existing audience has vanished. And ordinary, simple, regular users accept restrictions that may still be technically fragile, inconsistent, and extremely expensive to maintain. The clearest comparison comes from the war in Ukraine, where for years the public was repeatedly told that Russia could continue indefinitely, absorb unlimited personnel losses, spend endless fortunes and eventually reach Kiev, whether it required, as you would know, 3 days, 3 years or some undefined period beyond that. While anyone that suggested that manpower, finances, public patience and industrial capacity were limited, every single person like this was accused of misunderstanding the scale of the Russian state. But 4 years into the war, more than 4 years at this point, even many of the loudest supporters of the invincible Putin argument have become far more cautious. Because Russia's resources may be, and they are vast, but vast and infinite are not the same thing. Putin can commit the state to an objective and still fail to achieve it, particularly that when that objective meets organized resistance, repeated adaptation and an opponent that forces the government to spend more than it expected. And this is exactly why the comparison between the battlefield and the internet is so revealing. Because in both cases, the authorities can announce a destination, project total confidence, and insist that the outcome is inevitable. But the moment implementation itself begins, political certainty collides with engineering, logistics, countermeasures, and cost. Now keep this in mind because it is about to come back, since once we stop treating government announcements as magical commands and start examining the actual machinery beneath them, the removal of YouTube from Russian DNS records no longer looks like the final step towards total control, but instead begins to look like a sign that the more sophisticated machinery is already occupied somewhere else. Here's where it gets interesting, because Roskomnadzor's modern filtering system is not the primitive internet control system Russia used many years ago. And the authorities now do possess equipment capable of examining data packets, identifying traffic patterns, disrupting specific protocols, and apparently even theoretically applying AI-assisted analysis to determine which connections belong to Telegram, YouTube, VPN services, or any other platforms. Yet every single increase in sophistication also creates an increase in cost, computing demand, and the number of specialists required to keep this system running and functioning. Deep Packet Inspection, usually shortened to DPI, means that the filtering infrastructure does not merely look at where the information is going, because it also attempts to analyze characteristics inside the traffic itself, identify recognizable patterns, and then separate ordinary connections from the encrypted or disguised communications that the government wants to restrict. Which sounds extremely powerful when described in a press release or a crazy headline, but becomes extraordinarily difficult when applied continuously to tens if not hundreds of millions of users who are sending messages, downloading files, making calls, and using countless combinations of devices and software every second of every single day. Adding to this, AI models may improve, yes, the government's ability to recognize disguised traffic, but AI does not make the process free or unlimited, because the models require still, once again, computing capacity, engineers, and constant adaptation, while VPN providers and independent developers are simultaneously changing protocols, encryption methods, and systems specifically made to make identification way more difficult. Which, pretty much as you can see, creates just an endless contest in which every government solution encourages a new countermeasure, and every countermeasure forces the government to, once again, spend money again. At this point, you might be wondering why Russia simply cannot just purchase more equipment and attack every target simultaneously. But that is exactly where scale becomes decisive, because filtering the traffic of a country with around 140 million people is not comparable to just restricting one single office, one university, or one single small network. And the amount of processing required grows dramatically when the system must distinguish Telegram from WhatsApp, YouTube from ordinary Google services, one VPN protocol from another, and prohibited traffic from the enormous amount of legitimate, encrypted traffic that modern banking, communication, entertainment, and government services all depend upon. The authorities therefore have to prioritize in this case, even if they never publicly admit it. And the real choice may be Telegram, WhatsApp, or YouTube, rather than all three at just full intensity. Because a concentrated campaign against, for example, Telegram only, consumes the same finite processors, technical teams, and analytical capacity that would otherwise be used against YouTube or VPN infrastructure. While aggressive interference also risks disrupting unrelated services and creating enough visible technical problems that citizens begin noticing not as the power of the system, but its clumsiness. But that is only half of the story, because to understand why this DNS measure reveals weaknesses rather than strengths, we need to look at what the domain name system actually does. And once the mechanism becomes clear, the gap between intimidating announcement and the limited technical reality becomes just simply impossible to ignore. Now imagine this. Every time you type youtube.com or patreon.com/TheRussianDude into a browser and click a link in the description, because that's where you can watch these episodes in early access, and there will always be an additional chapter in the end. So yeah, when you enter those websites, your device needs to discover the numerical IP address associated with that name, and the domain name system, or DNS, performs this function in roughly the same way that a concierge in a large apartment complex building might check a list of all the residents and tell a visitor where a particular single person lives. Your browser politely asks this kind of concierge where youtube.com or patreon.com/RussianDude can be found. The DNS checks its records, returns an IP address, and the browser then travels to that address, which may be shared by hundreds or even thousands of websites, before identifying the specific service that it wants. Almost like arriving once again at this enormous apartment complex building and being told that the correct entrance is just 3 doors down besides a fig tree, I don't know. And although the real technical process is more complicated, this analogy captures the basic purpose of the system without requiring everyone to study the entire OSI model. Removing YouTube from the national DNS register is like tearing one page out of the concierge's directory, because when your browser once again asks for youtube.com, the Russian DNS server can respond that it simply cannot locate that name, which creates an error, obviously, and makes the platform appear unavailable to anyone who relies on that particular directory. But here's one thing. The building has not disappeared. The address has not ceased to exist. Google has not forgotten where YouTube is located. And the rest of the global internet has not removed the same page from every single other directory. So here's this one thing that nobody tells you probably. A user who already knows the root does not need to rely on the same concierge, because entry can be added to the host files that maps YouTube's domain name directly to an IP address, allowing the browser to bypass the local DNS lookup, while an external DNS service can provide the missing address from outside the Russian national system. And Google can then route the connection towards the correct destination, even though the original Russian directory pretends that YouTube cannot be found. I know it might have sounded complicated, took me some time to come up with this sentence, but well, here it is. The internet is not one college dormitory controlled by one concierge, because it is closer to an entire campus filled with different buildings, different directories, and different routes, which means that if the management of one of those dormitory orders its concierge to remove a page, a visitor may still simply ask another concierge who still has the complete list. And this is why changing to an external DNS can defeat such a crude restriction without requiring the kind of advanced technical expertise that the government would prefer people to imagine is necessary. There is also one more thing that you guys need to know before we can continue. Because once citizens begin using external DNS services, alternative VPN protocols, different encryption methods, and traffic masking systems in large numbers, the government does not merely face inconvenience, it faces a rising financial burden. And that turns digital resistance from a symbolic act into a direct strategy for stretching states' capacity. Now this detail changes everything, because the government's preferred outcome is not necessarily to build a flawless technical wall, but to make enough people believe that such a wall already exists. Since every user who gives up voluntarily saves Roskomnadzor money, every creator who abandons YouTube reduces the amount of traffic that must be analyzed, and every media organization that stops publishing removes one more target from the list without even forcing the authorities to invest in additional equipment or personnel. But when people refuse to cooperate with that image, the cost structure changes entirely. Because a large and diverse population using different VPN providers, different DNS services, and different encryption methods forces the filtering infrastructure to identify a constantly moving target. And even when Roskomnadzor disrupts one method, the victory still may be temporary for them. Since users migrate, developers update their software, and the government must begin another expensive cycle of detection and interference. A citizen paying somewhere, I don't know, between 3 or 500 rubles per month for a VPN, like $6-7, may appear insignificant compared with the resources of the Russian state. but millions of citizens making similar decisions can now require the government to deploy vastly way more expensive infrastructure in response. While some users pay nothing at all, even by just relying on free tools, external DNS services, or publicly shared configurations, which means that a relatively small personal effort can contribute to a much larger collective burden on the entire filtering system. Let's look at this now from a very different angle, because one of the unintended consequences of these restrictions is that they make the population more technically educated. And concepts that would once have seemed obscure, including these DNS, DPI, IP addresses, VPN protocols, or even the OSI models, are now being explained to audiences of hundreds of thousands or even millions through very simple analogies like this concierge, through guides, community discussions, which gradually reduces the effectiveness of the easiest blocking techniques. Most importantly, crude restrictions reveal weaknesses, because people who spent 2022 or 2023 saying that investing in Russian language YouTube was pointless, that all Western platforms would inevitably disappear, and that opposition media should start searching for alternatives, as unusual as, shortwave radio. All this now can compare to those predictions with reality, and, well, nothing happened. The reality is that the promised total isolation has still not arrived, despite years of announcements, pressure, technical experiments, and legal threats. The Russian state has committed itself to many ambitious outcomes before, including reaching Kyiv in 3 days, returning inflation to 4%, resolving the budget deficit, negotiating a deal with Trump, and going much further back to the beginning of Putin's rule, catching up with Portugal in GDP per capita. Yet political declarations do not automatically create results, and the longer the list of unfinished promises becomes, the more important it is to judge the government by implementation rather than presentation. And here's where it gets really fascinating, because the internet campaign has already lasted long enough to provide a historical test of this entire argument. And when we examine what has happened since the fall of 2012, the distance between the Kremlin's goal of digital complete isolation and the internet Russians actually use today becomes even more striking. The Russian government did not begin confronting the open internet yesterday, and the major campaign has been developing since the fall of 2012. Which means almost 14 years have passed since the first implementation and important restrictions were introduced, while approximately almost 2 years have passed since the authorities began their especially aggressive anti-YouTube campaign. Yet, as you can see, Russian citizens are still watching independent political analysis, communicating through foreign platforms and finding ways to reach information the state has tried to place beyond their view. Daily political programs recorded from undisclosed locations can still reach more than 1 million viewers, an audience comparable to the population of Austin or even Dallas. And those channels can still attract advertisers, maintain teams, and publish new episodes daily or weekly, which is not what complete informational isolation looks like, particularly after more than a decade of government pressure and repeated declarations that the remaining space for independent online communication is about to disappear completely. Russian viewers continue once again reading Meduza, Mediazona, despite long-standing restrictions. They continue using BBC News Russia, they call relatives through WhatsApp, they exchange messages through Telegram. And, well, guess what? They continue watching YouTube. YouTubers who have not lost neither their audiences nor every single source of funding, which does not mean, unfortunately, that the restrictions have had no effect, but it does mean that the government's objective of sealing the Russian internet away from the wider world has repeatedly encountered way more resistance than anticipated, way more complexity and technical limitation than the officials' confidence suggested. Access to the open internet now carries a price for many people, whether that price is 3 or 500 rubles per month, extra time spent changing settings, slower connections, or the frustration of testing multiple tools. And these obstacles, yes, they should not be dismissed, because convenience matters, obviously, and every added step reduces the number of users willing to continue. Yet inconvenience is still very different from total control, especially when accessible guides, affordable VPN services, external DNS options, and constantly updated protocols remain available to ordinary citizens rather than only to elite specialists. Here's a perspective most people don't even think about. Every failed attempt to create a perfect restriction also generates knowledge that survives the individual restriction. Because once a person learns how DNS works, changing DNS becomes way easier the next time. Once a family installs a VPN to continue WhatsApp call, that family may also use that same VPN to reach YouTube or independent media. And once a creator learns to distribute content across several platforms, the government must pressure all of those platforms all at once rather than just one single one, focusing their efforts on this, causing each government action to produce a more experienced and resilient audience. And nevertheless, there is still one more piece to this entire story, because the most important response is not technological alone, it is psychological. And the moment people stop treating government confidence as proof of government capacity, they begin asking way better questions, making better preparations, and refusing to surrender before the real contest has even started. The state may tear YouTube's page out of the one concierge's directory, but it cannot erase every address, every external DNS server, every VPN provider, and every person willing to ask just simply for another concierge, and just to ask concierge where this another building is located. And that is why this apparently dramatic restriction may ultimately teach Russians something the government never wanted them to learn in the first place, which is that an official declaration of control is not the same thing as control itself. Guys, please subscribe to our channel and like this video if today's story helped you see the Russian government's internet campaign from a very different angle, and that often loud proclamations are not as scary as they seem. Don't forget about our Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you on Monday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.